Following the success of German parachute forces in Scandinavia and the Low Countries in the spring of 1940, the American Army established a parachute test platoon. After evaluating the results, it was decided to activate the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion, composed of 3 companies. Parachute battalions would henceforth consist of only 3 companies with 3 platoons each, because it had no organic heavy weapons unit on company or platoon level. This table of organization was recorded in July 1941, when the 2nd Parachute Infantry Battalion was formed. Following the success of the German paratroopers on Crete in the spring of 1941, this 2nd Battalion was formed with a nucleus of troops from the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion. 2 other battalions were activated in the second half of 1941, but they would not have their full complement until after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The entry of the United States in the Second World War accelerated the formation of parachute units. In March 1942, the 503rd and 504th Battalion were used as the nucleus to form the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment by redesignating them the 1st and 2nd Battalion of this regiment. This made the 503rd the 1st Parachute Infantry Regiment, one of many to come. In June 1942, the regimental 2nd Battalion was detached and transferred to England in preparation for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Due to this transfer, the battalion was redesignated the 2nd Battalion of the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment. This battalion performed the American 1st Parachute Combat Drop in November 1942 in North Africa. The drop took place at Tarafarui and was the first night combat drop as well. This operation supported the landing of the American 1st Infantry Division, which was also supported by the 1st Ranger Battalion, by the way. Back in the US, the 502nd Parachute Infantry Battalion was expanded into the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment. The subsequent raised Parachute Infantry Regiments were formed from scratch, like the 504th, the 505th, the 506th and the 507th. Despite this multitude of parachute infantry regiments, only 2 airborne divisions were established in the summer of 1942. These divisions were not designated parachute infantry divisions, but named airborne division on purpose. They only contained 1 parachute infantry regiment with 3 battalions and were complemented with 2 glider infantry regiments containing 2 battalions each. Similarly, there would be only 1 parachute field artillery battalion and 2 glider field artillery battalions, and these would be under direct divisional command, just like the Airborne Engineer Battalion and the Airborne Anti-Aircraft Battalion. The Divisional Anti-Aircraft Battalion consisted of 6 batteries, of which half would act as anti-aircraft batteries and the other half as anti-tank batteries. The official organization and equipment of an airborne division was codified in the Table of Organization and Equipment 71 in October 1942. An exception to this order of battle was the extra parachute Field Artillery Battalion for the 82nd Airborne Division. 5 more parachute infantry regiments were raised in 1942, but interestingly, no more airborne divisions were formed that year. In October, the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment was raised. As mentioned before, the nucleus for the planned 509th was the first to go into action in November 1942, but eventually this regiment never came to fruition. The 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment inherited the number of the 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion, but it had hardly any personnel from this particular unit. The 501st Parachute Infantry Battalion was absorbed into the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment on its way to Australia, except C Company. C Company was used as the nucleus for the 1st Battalion of the 551st Parachute Infantry Regiment, which was planned as a full-blown regiment. Just like with the 509th Regiment, this unit would never expand to regiment size. The last regiment to be formed in 1942 was the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment. During the first quarter of 1943, the 511th and the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment were formed and saw the first deviation in the Airborne Division order of battle. The 82nd Airborne Division lost a glider regiment and received the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment in return, shifting the infantry balance within the division towards parachute infantry. This deviation was all the more remarkable because the two airborne divisions formed in the spring of 1943 had the same order of battle as the airborne divisions in 1942, with only one parachute infantry regiment and two glider regiments. That spring also saw the creation of the 1st Airborne Brigade, with one parachute infantry regiment and two glider regiments, and the 2nd Airborne Brigade. The 1st Airborne Brigade would keep its two glider regiments, while its parachute infantry regiment was transferred to the 2nd Airborne Brigade together with the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The introduction of the brigade seemed to signal that the army was looking to strike the correct balance of troops, and it was looking for the preferred airborne unit, the division or the brigade. Meanwhile, the 101st Airborne Division had followed the sister division and got an extra parachute infantry regiment, but without losing its 2nd glider regiment. The 82nd Airborne Division lost a majority of its 2nd Parachute Field Artillery Battalion after Sicily. In the summer of 1943, another new airborne division was also formed on the basis of the 1942 order of battle. In hindsight, the summer of 1943 saw the peak size of the number of American parachute infantry regiments. 2 training regiments were raised to supplement future losses of the parachute infantry regiments. So far, the parachute infantry regiments had only been in action in the Mediterranean from November 1942 onwards. In July 1943, the beginning of the Sicily campaign heralded the first regiment-sized airdrop of the parachute infantry regiments of the 82nd Airborne Division. The results of this drop casted doubts about the deployment of parachute troops in division-sized units. Eisenhower, the commander of the American operations in the Mediterranean, expressed his criticism as follows: "I do not believe in the airborne division. I believe that airborne troops should be reorganized in self-contained units, comprising infantry, artillery, and special services, all about the strength of a regimental combat team. To employ at any time and place a whole division would require a dropping over such an extended area that I seriously doubt that the division commander could regain control and operate the scattered forces as one unit." The concept of the airborne division was, however, given another chance in the summer of 1943 due to the intervention of General George C. Marshall, who ordered a review board to evaluate the performance of the 11th Airborne Division during maneuvers in the United States. Meanwhile, in the Pacific, the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment was successfully deployed by parachute in New Guinea. Although this regiment was the first parachute infantry regiment formed in February 1942, it had to wait 1.5 years until it was deployed. In Italy, the landing at Salerno on the Italian mainland was supported by a night jump of a Sol battalion of the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment and the 82nd Airborne Division. At least the Parachute Infantry Regiments were dropped in 2 consecutive night jumps while the Glider Regiment landed on the beach. In December 1943, 11th Airborne Division in the United States performed well during a large-scale exercise, as mentioned before. All these events in the second half of 1943 helped to turn the tables in favor of the Airborne Division. By the end of 1943, there were 5 Airborne Divisions and 4 independent parachute regiments, if we include the 2 training regiments. The units, which ultimately didn't reach regimental strength, retained their number and would remain on the roster as independent battalions. There was one company, the 555th, which was activated in December 1943. It was an all-black unit, including the officers, and was intended to grow into a battalion in the course of 1944. During the same month, the 515th Parachute Infantry Regiment was activated as the last Parachute Infantry Regiment raised during the war. This regiment was established in May 1943 as a cadre to train paratroopers coming from jump school into replacements for the other regiments, but in December it was decided to make it into an active regiment. Meanwhile, the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment had been detached from the 82nd Airborne Division, which was sent to England in preparation for D-Day, and the division received the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment instead. The first parachute operation in 1944 was the drop at Anzio in Italy of the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment to provide support for the landings in the form of a regimental combat team, together with 2 parachute field artillery battalions, while the Sol battalion of the 509th Parachute Infantry Regiment took part in the seaborne landing. In the first quarter of 1944, the 82nd and 101st Airborne Division were expanded by the addition of an extra parachute infantry regiment, and the 2nd Glider Regiment of the 101st was disbanded to provide a 3rd battalion to the remaining Glider Regiment in each division. The 542nd Parachute Infantry Regiment provided replacements for these divisions, and as a result it lost most of its men and was officially downsized to a battalion. The changes in the spring of 1944 meant that the structure of the 2 first Airborne Divisions had become distinct from the 3 divisions raised in 1943. The first 2 had 3 Parachute Infantry Regiments each, compared to just 1 Parachute Infantry Regiment for the other divisions. The glider component in the first 2 divisions was also diminished to just 1 regiment with 3 battalions, compared to the other divisions with 2 glider regiments with 2 battalions each. Another development was the gradual stripping of the 1943 Airborne Brigades, and with the cannibalization of these units, they gradually disappeared in 1944. The 82nd Airborne Division got back its 2nd Parachute Artillery Battalion from deployment in Italy. All of these changes to the first 2 Airborne Divisions were to prepare the deployment of these divisions in the Normandy campaign in June 1944 as the airborne element. It was the first nighttime drop on such a scale. Meanwhile, an airborne landing was planned in the south of France in support of the amphibious landings in August 1944. For this purpose, the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment was detached from the 17th Airborne Division in exchange for the 513th Parachute Infantry Regiment from the 13th Airborne Division, which was replaced with the 515th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment became part of the 1st Airborne Task Force. This was an inter-allied command which also contained the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion, the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion, the 550th Glider Infantry Battalion, supported by parachute artillery and glider artillery, plus airborne engineer units. We should in this context remember that the 509th Parachute Infantry Battalion was the first parachute unit to make a combat drop in November 1942, making it the most experienced parachute infantry unit. The 550th Battalion had been raised as an airborne unit in the Panama Canal Zone in 1942, but was converted to glider infantry to act as a strategic reserve in the Caribbean together with the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion in the years 1942-1943. The 509th, the 550th and the 551st were never expanded to regimental strength, but were downgraded to battalion size while retaining their unit number. In the summer of 1944, the 18th Airborne Army Corps was organized to command the 82nd, the 101st and 17th Airborne Divisions. Meanwhile, the 507th Parachute Infantry Regiment was transferred to the 17th Airborne Division, while the 504th Parachute Infantry Regiment returned to the 82nd Airborne Division. After Normandy, the Airborne Division had definitely become the primary unit of deployment for the American Parachute Forces. In September 1944, Operation Market Garden meant the largest airdrop in history so far, with the 101st and the 82nd Airborne Divisions and the British 1st Airborne Division. The summer of 1944 also saw parachute action in the Pacific. In July 1944, a parachute drop took place on the tiny island of Numfor in the context of the New Guinea campaign. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment was deployed in this operation in a bid to capture the island's airfields. By that time, the 11th Airborne Division had also arrived in New Guinea. The first combat operation of this division took place in November 1944 in the Philippines. This was in the context of the Battle for Leyte Island, where it was deployed as infantry until the spring of 1945. This was also the fate of the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment in December 1944 on the island of Mindoro, where it was deployed in the amphibious attack and basically used as infantry. Meanwhile, the Germans on the Western Front launched their Ardennes offensive. The bulk of the 18th Airborne Corps was lying in reserve near Reims, and its 2 divisions were rushed to the scene. The 101st Airborne Division would be surrounded in Bastogne, while the 82nd Airborne Division would bear the brunt of the SS armored divisions under the command of the 18th Airborne Corps. The 17th Airborne Division was airlifted from England to act as a covering force behind the Meuse. This meant that during the winter of 1944-45, all airborne divisions in the European and Pacific theaters of war were fighting as frontline infantry. The Airborne Task Force had been disbanded in November 1944, and during the Ardennes offensive, its battalions were distributed to divisions in the field as reinforcements. The 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment was also deployed in the Ardennes as an independent regiment under the 18th Airborne Corps. Meanwhile, the 555th Parachute Infantry Company had been expanded into a battalion. Despite the severe losses of the Parachute Infantry Regiments at the front, this all-black unit was never called upon and spent the rest of the war on the American mainland. In January 1945, the 101st Airborne Division was struck to Alsace to help to steady the front line in that sector. Meanwhile, the 17th and 82nd Airborne Divisions were kept in the line to push back the bulge, which was created by the Ardennes offensive. In the Pacific, the 11th Airborne Division was fighting as infantry in the Philippines. In the context of the campaign to liberate the Philippines, the Americans made the largest parachute drop in the Pacific so far south of Manila Bay with the 511th Parachute Infantry Regiment. This was in line with the trend in the Pacific Theater to drop relatively small units rather than whole divisions like in the European theater. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment had only jumped in New Guinea with 1 battalion in September 1943 and 2 battalions in July 1944. February 1945 saw the capture of the fortress island of Corregidor at the entrance of Manila Bay by means of the 1st regiment-sized jump by the 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment. Despite its deployment into the Pacific, the 11th Airborne Division would never be dropped as a unit, but was rather deployed as regular infantry in the general offensive towards Manila. An exception was the company-sized drop for the liberation of the Los Baños prison camp. Even the veteran 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment was treated as a stepchild of the army, because it was used as ordinary line infantry for mopping up Japanese on Negro Island for the remainder of the war, rather than its intended use as parachute infantry. The first 2 airborne divisions in the European theater would also remain in the field as infantry until the end of the war. In February 1945, the 82nd Airborne Division was stripped of the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment to act as a reserve for the Western Front and got the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment in return. It also lost the 509th and 551st Parachute Infantry Battalions, which were disbanded not long thereafter. In March 1945, the Airborne Divisions went through a restructuring whereby all Airborne Divisions on the Western Front were to become organized in a similar way. This meant 2 Parachute Infantry Regiments for each division, so the 82nd Airborne Division lost the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment to the 13th Airborne Division. Each division would henceforth have only 1 glider regiment of 3 battalions. In terms of artillery, the 13th and 17th Airborne Division got their 2nd Parachute Artillery Battalion. Last but not least, the divisional order of battle was augmented by the addition of an organic reconnaissance platoon. During the same month, the 18th Airborne Corps would make the last large-scale parachute drop of the war. For this purpose, this Army Corps was taken out of the front line together with the 101st Airborne Division, and the 17th and the 13th Airborne Divisions were attached to this Army Corps to perform the parachute drop. The 13th Airborne Division was however soon detached because the Allied Air Force didn't have enough capacity to drop this division. The parachute operation under the code name Varsity went ahead to support the British Rhine crossing. The American 17th Airborne Division and the British 6th Airborne Division protected the British bridgehead against German counterattacks. The 17th Airborne Division fought as infantry until the end of the war in Western Europe, with the other airborne divisions on the Western Front. The exception was the 13th Airborne Division, which was in reserve in France since its arrival in February 1945, but never went into action on the Western Front because the fast advance of the Allied armies into Germany made airdroppings redundant. The 11th Airborne Division had so far not followed the divisional restructuring in March, except for the upgrading of its glider regiments to 3 battalions in May. In July, the 541st Parachute Infantry Regiment, which had acted as a training outfit until then, was airlifted to the Philippines. Upon arrival, it was divided up to provide reinforcements for the 11th Airborne Division. This allowed the conversion of a glider regiment into the 188th Parachute Infantry Regiment. The divisional artillery was also modeled after the other airborne divisions by the conversion of a glider artillery battalion into a parachute artillery battalion. July 1945 was the month the American Army prepared for the invasion of Japan, an operation in which the airborne element would play a significant part. For this purpose, the unproven 13th Airborne Division was moved back to America to transfer to the Pacific, where it would prepare for the airborne invasion together with the 11th Airborne Division. The dropping of the atomic bombs made the parachute operation redundant. The 11th Airborne Division was, however, in the end the first American unit to land on the Japanese main island when it was airlifted after the surrender of the island nation in August 1945. In hindsight, the Parachute Infantry Regiment was a main parachute unit in 1942, and it was not until the autumn of 1943 that the Airborne Division became a well-established fact. Even after the formation of airborne divisions, independent regiments continued to persist and be deployed. The 503rd Parachute Infantry Regiment was, for example, not only the first major unit to be formed in March 1942, but also the only one which remained an independent unit until the war's end in August 1945. Even after the acceptance of the Airborne Division as the operational benchmark unit for parachute operations, the Army had to find the right mix of parachute, glider and supporting units. This process was not finished until March 1945, by which time the war was almost over. Unfortunately, by then, most divisions were deployed as regular line infantry, and not in their role as parachute infantry. If you like my content, don't forget to subscribe and click on the bell to get notifications for new content.